The envelope was waiting in my mailbox when I got back from physical therapy with my son. It was one of those thick white envelopes that people notice immediately because nobody sends good news in something that official. I remember standing at the end of my driveway, looking at it while my son Ethan adjusted the brace on his right leg from the passenger seat. "Another HOA letter?" he asked. "Probably," I said. He tried to smile, but I could tell he was tired. Physical therapy days always wore him out. Ethan was 16 then. Smart kid. Tough kid. The kind of kid who learned how to laugh through pain because he didn't have much choice. He was born with a neurological condition that affected the muscles in his right leg. Some days he could move around almost normally. Other days every step looked like work. I opened the envelope before we even pulled away from the mailbox. The fine was for $500. Reason: unauthorized wheelchair ramp visible from community roadway. I read it twice, then a third time. My son stared at me. "What is it?" I handed him the paper. His eyes moved across the page. The smile disappeared. "Oh," that single word hurt more than the fine. Not because of the money, because I knew exactly what he was thinking. The ramp wasn't some decoration. It wasn't a project. It wasn't something we built because we wanted attention. We built it because there were days Ethan physically couldn't make it up the front steps. I folded the paper carefully and put it back inside the envelope. "We'll deal with it," I said. But the truth was I was already angry. Not loud angry. Not shouting angry. The dangerous kind. The kind that stays quiet. The kind that starts paying attention. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel. Now tell me in the comments. What would you do in my place? Stay quiet or fight back? Harper. I'm 52 years old. Former firefighter. 27 years on the job before retirement. My wife, Laura, teaches elementary school. We moved into Cedar Ridge Estates 6 years earlier because we wanted a safe neighborhood with decent schools and sidewalks wide enough for Ethan's mobility equipment. At first, the neighborhood seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, clean parks, friendly neighbors. The HOA mostly sent reminders about trash cans and lawn maintenance. Nothing unusual. Then a woman named Carol Bennett became HOA president. Everything changed after that. Carol treated the HOA like a personal kingdom. Rules multiplied. Warning letters appeared everywhere. People got notices about flower pots, holiday decorations, mailbox colors. One family received a violation because their basketball hoop was visible from the street. Most people complained privately and paid the fines. Nobody wanted trouble, especially not with Carol. She seemed to enjoy conflict. The first time she targeted us was over Ethan's accessible parking space. We had converted part of our driveway to make it easier for him to enter and exit our van safely. The modification met every county requirement, passed every inspection. Yet Carol still sent a warning letter. According to her, the painted access markings were aesthetic violations. I ignored it. The county approved it. End of discussion. Or so I thought. Now I was holding a $500 fine over a wheelchair ramp. When we got home, Ethan went inside while I stood outside looking at the ramp. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't oversized. It was a simple wooden structure built by volunteers from a local disability support organization. Everything about it was legal. Everything about it was necessary. Yet somehow it had become a problem. That evening I attended the HOA meeting. The clubhouse was crowded. More crowded than usual. Apparently I wasn't the only resident receiving strange notices. Carol sat at the front table wearing a bright blue blazer and an expression that suggested she enjoyed being the center of attention. When the public comment period began, I stood. "My son needs that ramp," I said calmly. "Why was this fine issued?" Carol barely looked up from her papers. "The structure violates community appearance standards. It's a disability accommodation. The board disagrees." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. I noticed several residents exchanging looks. Even they seemed surprised. "What part of disability accommodation is confusing?" I asked. Carol finally looked directly at me. "The board believes alternative solutions are available." "What alternative solutions?" She shrugged. That's not our responsibility. The room became very quiet. I remember hearing the air conditioning system running overhead. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then Ethan's friend Marcus stood up from the back row. He couldn't have been more than 17. Alternative solutions? He said. You mean walking? Carol's expression hardened. This meeting is not open for disruptions. Marcus sat down. But the damage was done. People were paying attention now. For the first time, I saw uncertainty on Carol's face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. The board voted to uphold the fine. 3 votes to 2. Meeting adjourned. Just like that. As residents filed out, several stopped to talk with me. Some were angry. Some were embarrassed. One elderly woman squeezed my arm and whispered, "This isn't right." I thanked her. Then I went home. That should have been the end of it. Pay the fine. Appeal later. Move on. That's what most people would have done. But firefighters spend decades learning something important. Small problems become big disasters when ignored. And Carol wasn't finished. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This time the fine was $1,000. Reason: repeated violation. The ramp hadn't changed. Nothing had changed. Except the amount they wanted. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the notice while Ethan worked on homework nearby. "Don't fight them because of me," he said quietly. I looked up. "What? You already do enough." I could hear the guilt in his voice. That's what made me decide. Not the money. Not the HOA. Not Carol. The guilt. A 16-year-old kid should never feel responsible for adults behaving badly. I folded the notice. Set it aside. And for the first time, I started documenting everything. Every letter. Every email. Every conversation. Every fine. Every vote. I bought a binder. Then another. Within weeks, both were filling up. At the time, I thought I was preparing for a legal dispute. What I didn't know was that someone else was paying attention too. Someone outside the neighborhood. Someone with a camera. Someone who would eventually turn our small HOA fight into a story seen by millions. And when the media finally arrived, Carol Bennett discovered something firefighters learn early. When you play with fire long enough, eventually the whole world sees the smoke. The first reporter didn't arrive in a news van. She didn't carry a camera crew. She didn't even introduce herself as a journalist. She showed up as a parent. At least that's what I thought. It was a Saturday afternoon about 3 weeks after the second fine arrived. I was replacing a section of fence in the backyard while Ethan worked on a school project at the patio table. A woman walked up the driveway carrying a notebook. She looked to be in her late 30s. Professional but casual. The kind of person who blended into a crowd. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. "That's me. My name is Rachel." She glanced toward the ramp. I heard about what's happening. I thanked her and assumed she was another concerned resident. By that point, several neighbors had already stopped by to express support. What made Rachel different was the questions. Most people asked how Ethan was doing. Rachel asked for dates, copies of notices, board meeting records, vote counts, exact wording, specific names, specific actions, specific timelines. After 20 years around emergency scenes, I learned how to recognize people gathering facts. Rachel wasn't making conversation. She was building a story. Still, she never said she was a reporter. Not that day. We talked for almost an hour. Ethan eventually joined us. Rachel spoke to him respectfully. Not like a child. Not like someone to pity. Just another person. That mattered. When she left, she handed me a card. The logo in the corner immediately caught my attention. It belonged to the largest television station in the region. I looked up. Rachel smiled. "I probably should have mentioned that earlier." I laughed. "Probably. We're investigating HOA complaints across 3 counties. I nodded. Then she added something I didn't expect. "Your family's situation isn't the only one." That sentence stayed with me long after she drove away. Because until then I had viewed our problem as personal. One HOA. One family. One unfair dispute. Rachel was suggesting something bigger. Pattern. A few days later she called. Then called again. Then again. Every conversation brought new questions. Not just about our fines. About Carol. About board decisions. About contracts. About spending. About legal threats sent to residents. The deeper Rachel looked, the more interested she became. That usually means one of two things. Either there's no story at all, or there's a much larger one hiding underneath. Meanwhile, the HOA continued escalating. The fines increased weekly. 500 became 1,000. 1,000 became 2,000. Then 4,000. The amounts were ridiculous. Completely disconnected from reality. By the end of the month, they claimed we owed nearly $10,000. For a wheelchair ramp. I remember staring at one notice and actually laughing. Not because it was funny, because the number looked absurd. Laura didn't laugh. She worried constantly. About lawyers. About liens. About our home. About Ethan. Especially Ethan. Kids notice more than adults realize. At school, some students had started talking about the dispute. Most were supportive. A few weren't. One afternoon, Ethan came home unusually quiet. That was never a good sign. What happened? I asked. He shrugged. Nothing. I waited. Eventually, he sat at the kitchen table. A guy said the neighborhood would be better if we moved. The room went silent. Laura stopped washing dishes. I felt my jaw tighten. What exactly did he say? Ethan stared at the table. He said people like me make property values go down. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Some moments don't create anger. They create clarity. That was one of them. The problem wasn't a ramp. It never had been. The ramp was simply the excuse. The target was my son. And once I understood that, my patience changed. Not disappeared. Changed. I stopped hoping the board would become reasonable. Instead, I started preparing for what came next. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread throughout the community. Residents lined the walls. People stood in hallways. Several homeowners brought copies of violation notices they believed were unfair. Carol walked into the room looking irritated, like someone forced to attend an event she no longer controlled. Public comments lasted almost an hour. Resident after resident stood up. Some spoke about fines. Others spoke about selective enforcement. Several mentioned intimidation. Then an elderly veteran named Robert Jenkins approached the microphone. Robert had lived in Cedar Ridge longer than almost anyone. People respected him. When he spoke, rooms listened. He looked directly at the board. I've lived here 11 years, he said. I've never been embarrassed by this community until now. Nobody interrupted. You fined a disabled child for using a disability ramp. The room became completely silent. You should be ashamed. Carol immediately tried to move to the next agenda item. The crowd wasn't having it. People began speaking over one another. Questions came from every direction. Residents demanded explanations. Financial records. Meeting minutes. Legal justifications. For the first time, the board looked overwhelmed. And for the first time, Carol looked scared. Only slightly, but enough. Enough to notice. Enough to remember. After the meeting ended, Rachel approached me outside. This time she brought a cameraman. That was new. She asked if I'd be willing to do an interview. I agreed. Not because I wanted attention. Because I wanted facts recorded accurately. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Most of it probably never aired. Rachel asked about Ethan. About the ramp. About the fines. About our family. Then she asked a question that surprised me. What happens if they keep escalating? I looked toward my house. Toward the ramp. Toward the place where my son should have felt safe. Then we'll keep standing here. She nodded. The story aired 3 nights later. Everything changed. Not immediately, but close. The segment opened with drone footage of the neighborhood. Then footage of the ramp. Then footage of Ethan walking carefully up it. No dramatic music. No exaggerated narration. Just facts. Cold facts. The kind that become difficult to defend. By the next morning, the station's website had thousands of comments. Most supported us. Some were angry. A few were furious. Not at us. At the HOA. Then national blogs picked up the story. Then disability advocacy groups. Then larger media outlets started calling. Suddenly people from states I'd never visited knew Ethan's name. The HOA responded with a statement. According to Carol, the board was being unfairly portrayed. According to Carol, the issue was community standards. According to Carol, the media lacked important context. There was just one problem. Every time she spoke publicly, things got worse. Because the facts never changed. A disabled teenager needed a ramp. The HOA fined him anyway. That's not a complicated story. And simple stories travel fast. Especially when ordinary people recognize injustice. What none of us knew then was that Rachel's investigation had already uncovered something far bigger than disability discrimination. Something hidden inside HOA financial records. Something involving money. And when that information surfaced, the fines against my son would become the least of Carol Bennett's problems. The first sign that something bigger was happening came from a phone call I wasn't supposed to know about. At least that's how it felt later. Rachel called me on a Thursday evening and asked a question that seemed unrelated to Ethan's ramp. Do you know anything about Cedar Ridge Property Services? I had never heard the name before. It sounds familiar, I said. Check your HOA documents. After we hung up, I went through several binders and eventually found it. Cedar Ridge Property Services. The company responsible for landscaping contracts, maintenance approvals, and several community improvement projects. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Most HOAs hire outside contractors. Nothing unusual there. But Rachel sounded interested. And journalists don't spend weeks investigating ordinary things. The next afternoon, she visited our house again. This time she looked excited. Not happy. Focused. There's a difference. She spread several public records across our kitchen table. Corporate filings. County records. Business registrations. Financial disclosures. Pages and pages of paperwork. I recognized very little of it. Rachel pointed to one name, then another, then another. Every document seemed connected somehow. Finally, she sat back. Look at the ownership records. I studied the paperwork. At first, I didn't understand. Then I saw it. The registered owner of Cedar Ridge Property Services wasn't some independent contractor. It was Carol's brother. I looked up. Rachel nodded. Now keep reading. The company had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the HOA over the previous 3 years. Landscaping, fence repairs, community beautification, administrative consulting. Most of the payments had been approved during board meetings led by Carol. I felt a chill run through me. Not because corruption surprised me, because it explained so much. The endless fines, the aggressive enforcement, the obsession with generating revenue. Money changes people's priorities. Always has. Always will. Rachel wasn't finished. She showed me invoices. Many looked questionable. Some listed projects residents claimed never happened. Others involved charges significantly higher than comparable work elsewhere. One landscaping project alone appeared to cost nearly 3 times the normal rate. Every road seemed to lead back to the same place. The same company. The same family. The same people. For the first time since the dispute began, I stopped thinking about winning our case. Something else was happening. Something larger than a wheelchair ramp. Rachel eventually left with her documents. I sat at the kitchen table long after dark. Laura joined me. What are you thinking? I tapped one of the papers. They got greedy. She nodded slowly. Greed is dangerous because it creates blind spots. People become convinced they're untouchable. They stop hiding. They stop being careful. They start believing rules apply only to everyone else. Over the next 2 weeks, the media coverage intensified. The original story had focused on Ethan. Now reporters were asking questions about HOA finances. Questions Carol clearly didn't want answered. Her public statements became increasingly defensive, then increasingly aggressive. Then increasingly strange. At one point she appeared on local television and claimed the board was the victim of an organized harassment campaign. That interview backfired immediately. The host asked a simple question. Why fine a disability ramp? Carol talked for nearly 3 minutes without answering. Viewers noticed. So did advertisers. So did residents. Meanwhile, support for Ethan exploded. Cards arrived from across the country. Letters, emails, messages. One disability advocacy organization sent a grant offer for future accessibility improvements. A retired contractor volunteered to upgrade the ramp at no cost. A local restaurant organized a fundraiser. We politely declined most financial help. Other families needed it more than we did. But the kindness mattered, especially to Ethan. For months he had felt isolated, targeted, different. Now complete strangers were telling him he mattered. That leaves a mark on a person. A good one. One afternoon I found him reading letters at the dining room table. Hundreds of them. Some came from veterans. Others from parents. Some from disabled adults who shared similar experiences. He looked up and smiled. Not the forced smile I'd seen after the first fine. A real one. I didn't know this many people cared. Neither did I. The next HOA meeting became absolute chaos. More than 200 residents attended. Some stood outside because the clubhouse couldn't hold everyone. Several local reporters showed up. Cameras lined the back wall. Carol looked furious. Not nervous. Furious. That's usually what happens when people lose control. The meeting began badly and somehow got worse. Residents demanded access to financial records. Board members argued among themselves. Questions flew from every direction. Then a homeowner named Lisa Reynolds stood up. Lisa had worked as an accountant for nearly 20 years. She brought spreadsheets. Actual spreadsheets. Detailed spreadsheets. She walked through payment records line by line. Contract by contract. Invoice by invoice. Every questionable transaction suddenly appeared on a giant projector screen. The room erupted. People shouted. Others gasped. Some simply stared. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. Every new figure generated more outrage. Carol attempted to end the meeting early. Residents refused. Security was called. The sheriff's department arrived. Not because anyone became violent. Because nobody wanted to leave. That image appeared on the evening news. Homeowners demanding answers while deputies stood nearby. The story spread even further. Then something happened that nobody expected. 3 HOA board members resigned within 48 hours. Not Carol. The others. One released a public statement claiming they had relied on information provided by HOA leadership. Another hired an attorney. The third disappeared completely. Suddenly the board looked less like a united front and more like people trying to escape a sinking ship. Rachel called again. Her voice sounded different. Serious. Someone contacted us. Who? A former employee. That got my attention. Former employees often know where bodies are buried. Metaphorically speaking. Rachel explained that a previous administrative assistant had provided internal emails. Lots of emails. According to the source, board leadership specifically discussed targeting homeowners considered unlikely to fight back. Elderly residents. Single parents. Families dealing with medical issues. The strategy was simple. Pressure people who already had enough problems. Most would pay. Few would resist. I felt sick. Not surprised. Sick. There's a difference. Corruption becomes easier to understand once you recognize it. Cruelty never does. Then Rachel told me one final thing. Among those emails was a discussion about Ethan. One board member had expressed concern about public backlash. Carol's response was short. Nobody will care. The message aired 2 weeks later. Millions of people heard it. And when they did, the entire situation exploded beyond anything Cedar Ridge had ever imagined. Because people might disagree about politics, taxes, schools, almost anything. But most people know exactly how they feel when adults bully a disabled kid. And the country was about to make its opinion very clear. The email hit the public on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, Cedar Ridge Estates was famous for all the wrong reasons. I woke up before sunrise, mostly out of habit. Years in the fire service train your body to expect alarms at odd hours. I made coffee, stepped onto the back porch, and checked my phone. There were hundreds of notifications, messages, emails, missed calls, news alerts. For a moment, I thought something had happened to a family member. Then I remembered the story. Rachel's station had released the follow-up investigation the night before. The segment included financial records, board communications, contract details, and one sentence that immediately became national news. Nobody will care. According to the report, those words came directly from Carol when concerns were raised about targeting a disabled teenager. Turns out she was wrong. People cared. A lot. By 8 o'clock that morning, major news outlets were discussing the story. National disability organizations issued statements. Radio hosts talked about it. Podcasters talked about it. Even people who had never heard of our neighborhood suddenly had opinions about Cedar Ridge Estates. The attention created pressure. Pressure created mistakes. And Carol began making them faster than anyone could count. Her first mistake was trying to deny the email existed. Unfortunately for her, the station possessed copies. Her second mistake was claiming the messages were taken out of context. That argument lasted about 6 hours before additional emails surfaced. Her third mistake was attacking the media directly. That one lasted even less time. The more she spoke, the worse things became. Meanwhile, something interesting happened inside the neighborhood. People who had stayed quiet for years started talking. Not privately, publicly. Stories emerged everywhere. One resident described receiving fines while recovering from cancer treatment. Another explained how repeated violations had been issued while she was caring for her elderly mother. A retired couple revealed they had paid thousands of dollars in penalties simply because they couldn't afford legal challenges. Every story sounded different, yet somehow they all felt familiar. The pattern was impossible to miss. Pressure people who are already struggling. Collect the money. Move on. By Friday, attorneys were contacting homeowners. Lots of attorneys. Class action specialists. Civil rights lawyers. Consumer protection firms. People smelled opportunity. Not because of Ethan's story alone. Because dozens of families now claimed similar treatment. The legal exposure was growing rapidly. Then another surprise arrived. The State Disability Rights Office announced a formal review. That changed everything. Media attention creates embarrassment. Government investigations create consequences. The HOA suddenly faced both. I remember standing in the driveway when a black SUV pulled up. 2 individuals stepped out carrying folders. They introduced themselves and explained they were gathering information regarding accessibility complaints. Professional, polite, thorough. They spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents. Every notice, every fine, every communication. Before leaving, one investigator paused beside the ramp. "How long has this been here?" "About 2 years." She nodded. "And it was never an issue before?" "No." She wrote something down, then thanked us and left. I didn't know exactly what she was thinking, but I had a feeling the answer mattered. The following week became one of the strangest periods of my life. Reporters parked outside the neighborhood entrance. Residents conducted interviews on sidewalks. National organizations issued public statements. At one point, a television crew from another state asked if they could film our mailbox. I never understood why. News works differently than real life. One afternoon, I drove Ethan to therapy. As we entered the parking lot, several people recognized him. Not because they knew him personally, because they'd seen the story. A woman approached cautiously. She told Ethan her daughter also used mobility equipment. Then she thanked him. Not me, him. After she left, Ethan stared out the window. What was that about? I smiled. People see courage differently than we do. He thought about that for a moment. I don't feel courageous. Most courageous people don't. That conversation stayed with me, because while the media focused on investigations and scandals, Ethan was still just a teenager trying to live his life. Homework, friends, physical therapy, School. The attention sometimes overwhelmed him, yet he handled it better than many adults would have. The pressure on Carol continued building. Board meetings became impossible. Residents demanded resignations. Financial records disappeared, then reappeared. Lawyers started attending sessions. Conversations became tense. Every decision faced scrutiny. Every statement generated headlines. Then the situation reached another level. A whistleblower emerged publicly. Not anonymously. Publicly. His name was Kevin Morales. For 4 years Kevin had worked for Cedar Ridge Property Services, the same company connected to Carol's brother. Kevin appeared on television and described what he witnessed. Inflated invoices, questionable billing practices, work orders that never existed, projects approved without competitive bids. The allegations were serious, very serious. More importantly, he brought documents, boxes of them. The story dominated local news for days, and for the first time, Carol stopped giving interviews. Silence replaced confidence. Silence replaced accusations. Silence replaced explanations. When people suddenly stop talking, there's usually a reason. The next HOA meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Residents packed the room. Cameras filled every corner. Everyone expected a confrontation. Instead, Carol entered carrying a folder. She walked directly to the podium, read a prepared statement, then resigned. Just like that. No questions. No discussion. No debate. She simply stepped away and left through a side door. The room sat in stunned silence. For months she had acted unstoppable, untouchable, certain. Now she was gone. Yet strangely, nobody celebrated. Because everyone understood the same thing. Resignation wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The financial investigations were still ongoing. The disability review remained active. The lawsuits were multiplying. And somewhere inside thousands of pages of records, people were still searching for answers. As residents slowly left the clubhouse that night, an elderly man stopped me near the exit. I recognized him immediately, Mr. Thompson, one of the first homeowners in Cedar Ridge. He shook my hand firmly, then looked toward the empty podium. "You know," he said quietly, "this was never about that ramp." I nodded, because he was right. The ramp had simply revealed what already existed. Like smoke escaping from a wall before anyone notices the fire. The real problem had been there all along. People just needed a reason to look. What none of us knew then was that investigators had already found something even more damaging than the financial records. Something involving forged approvals. Something involving HOA elections. Something that would transform a neighborhood controversy into a criminal case. And when that information finally surfaced, several former board members would discover that resigning from power doesn't protect you from what comes afterward. A week after Carol resigned, life should have started returning to normal. Didn't. If anything, the situation became even more complicated. The media trucks gradually disappeared, but investigators remained. Lawyers remained. Questions remained. And every day seemed to uncover something new. The first indication came from a certified letter delivered to several homeowners, including me. It informed residents that certain board actions taken during the previous 3 years were under review because of potential irregularities involving elections, voting procedures, and official approvals. The language sounded careful, legal, measured, but the message underneath was obvious. Someone believed the board's authority itself might have been compromised. That possibility shocked people. Residents could understand bad decisions. They could understand unfair enforcement. But questioning whether leadership had been legitimately elected was something else entirely. Within days, rumors spread across the neighborhood. Some claimed ballots had disappeared. Others claimed vote totals never matched attendance records. Nobody seemed to know exactly what was true. Then the documents started surfacing. One evening Rachel called again. By then we'd spoken so often that conversations felt almost routine. "Have you seen today's filing?" "No." "You should." She sent me a copy. I spent nearly an hour reading it. By the time I finished, I understood why she sounded concerned. According to investigators, several HOA elections contained serious discrepancies. Proxy votes appeared without proper authorization. Attendance records conflicted with vote totals. Some signatures looked questionable. Very questionable. Most disturbing of all, certain approvals involving contracts connected to Carol's brother appeared to rely on those same disputed votes. If true, the implications were enormous. The contracts, the fines, the enforcement policies, everything suddenly existed under a cloud of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Ethan was trying to focus on final exams. I felt bad for him. Teenagers deserve ordinary problems. Math tests, driving lessons, school projects. Instead, he found himself living inside a story that seemed to grow larger every week. One evening, we sat on the porch together. The sun was setting behind the trees. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost normal. "You think it'll ever end?" he asked. "Eventually. You always say eventually." I laughed. "Because it's usually true." He considered that, then looked toward the street. "People wave more now." "They do. Why?" The answer took a moment. "Because most people want to do the right thing." He raised an eyebrow. "After everything that's happened?" "Sometimes people need a reminder." That seemed to satisfy him, at least for the moment. The next major development arrived unexpectedly. A county investigator held a public information session for residents. The room filled quickly. More than 100 homeowners attended. Everyone wanted answers. Unfortunately, investigations don't move at the speed people prefer. The investigator couldn't discuss every detail, couldn't name every person, couldn't reveal every finding. But he did confirm something important. Evidence suggested official records had been altered. The room went silent. Altered records. Those two words carry weight, especially when money is involved, especially when authority is involved, especially when lawyers are already circling. Questions came immediately. Who altered them? When? Why? The investigator declined to answer. Not because he didn't know, because he couldn't. Not yet. Still, the damage was done. Residents left with more concern than reassurance. And the pressure continued building. Then came the audit. For months, people had demanded an independent review of HOA finances. Now they were finally getting one. Professional auditors arrived and began examining years of records. Bank statements, contracts, invoices, meeting minutes, payment approvals, everything. The process took weeks. Long weeks. Every few days another rumor surfaced. Another alleged discovery. Another questionable transaction. Some stories proved inaccurate. Others proved very accurate. Nobody knew which was which anymore. Then one afternoon Rachel called with news. Real news. Not rumors. Not speculation. News. They found unauthorized payments. I sat up straighter. How many? Still counting. That answer told me enough. If investigators were still counting, the number probably wasn't small. The official findings arrived 2 weeks later. Residents received copies electronically.
I-printed mine.
37 pages. I read every word. The auditors identified numerous concerns. Questionable contracts, improper approvals, missing documentation, conflict of interest issues. Several payments lacked sufficient support. Others appeared significantly inflated. The total amount under scrutiny exceeded anything most homeowners expected. People were furious. Not because mistakes happened. Because many residents had sacrificed financially while leadership spent money with astonishing carelessness. Retirees paid fines. Families paid assessments. Some homeowners struggled to cover expenses. Meanwhile, funds flowed through a system that appeared deeply compromised. The community meeting held after the audit became one of the largest gatherings in neighborhood history. Residents packed every available seat. Many stood along the walls. Others waited outside. A temporary board had been appointed following the resignations. They faced an impossible task. Answer questions they didn't create. Repair damage they didn't cause. Restore trust that barely existed. To their credit, they tried. For hours they listened. People expressed anger. frustration, disappointment. Some cried. Others demanded criminal charges. Several simply wanted explanations. One woman described postponing medical treatment because of escalating HOA costs. Another explained how repeated fines nearly pushed her family into foreclosure. The stories kept coming. And every story reminded everyone why the investigation mattered. Near the end of the meeting, the temporary board president made an announcement. The HOA would formally rescind every fine issued against our family, including all penalties related to Ethan's ramp. The room applauded. I appreciated the gesture. But honestly, that wasn't what mattered most anymore. The fines were never the entire problem. The culture that created them was. After the meeting ended, dozens of residents approached us. Some offered support. Others apologized for staying silent. A few admitted they'd been afraid. I understood. Fear makes people hesitate, especially when they believe they're standing alone. The truth is, most of them weren't bad people. Most had simply convinced themselves someone else would speak up. That's a common mistake. History is full of it. A few days later, another development changed everything again. State investigators executed a search warrant connected to records from Cedar Ridge Property Services. The news spread instantly. Reporters returned. Cameras returned. Public attention returned. And for the first time since the story began, criminal investigators openly acknowledged an active case. That announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Because civil disputes are one thing, criminal investigations are something entirely different. The following morning, as I drank coffee on the porch, Rachel called. Her voice sounded more serious than ever. They found evidence connected to the elections. What kind of evidence? There was a brief pause. Then she answered. The kind that can send people to prison. And suddenly the story that began with a disability ramp entered a completely new chapter. The phrase stayed in my head for the rest of the day. The kind that can send people to prison. I've heard a lot of serious statements in my life. Fires, emergencies, accidents, situations where a few words changed everything. Rachel wasn't someone who exaggerated. If she said investigators had found something significant, they had found something significant. The neighborhood felt different after that. Not louder, quieter. People still mowed lawns, walked dogs, checked mail. But underneath those ordinary routines was a sense of waiting. Everyone knew something was coming. Nobody knew exactly what. 3 days later, the first public confirmation arrived. The county prosecutor announced that a grand jury had been convened to review evidence connected to the HOA investigation. The statement was brief, carefully worded, but it confirmed what many residents already suspected. The matter had moved beyond administrative reviews, beyond civil complaints, beyond bad leadership. Criminal allegations were now being examined. That evening, every local news station led with the story. Rachel's report included interviews with former residents, financial experts, and legal analysts. One attorney summarized the situation in a single sentence. If investigators can prove records were intentionally altered, the consequences could be severe. The word intentionally mattered. Mistakes happen. Negligence happens. Intentional misconduct is different. Intentional misconduct changes everything. Meanwhile, our family was trying to reclaim some version of normal life. Ethan finished his exams. Laura wrapped up another school year. I spent more time working around the house. Simple things. Repairing fences. Cleaning the garage. Projects that kept my hands busy. Yet no matter how hard I tried, the story followed us. One afternoon I stopped at a hardware store. A man I had never met shook my hand. Another customer bought my coffee. Someone else thanked Ethan for speaking publicly. The support was appreciated. But it also reminded me how far the situation had spread. Months earlier, we were just another family in another neighborhood. Now strangers recognized us. That still felt strange. Then came the subpoenas. News spread quickly that former board members had received legal notices requiring testimony and records. The reports weren't official at first. Just rumors. Then attorneys confirmed them. Then reporters confirmed them. Then everyone knew. The investigation was accelerating. Not slowing down. Accelerating. Around the same time, more former insiders began speaking. One contractor described pressure to inflate bids. Another claimed certain vendors received preferential treatment. A former administrative assistant discussed unusual instructions involving record retention. Each new revelation added another layer. Each layer made the overall picture worse. The temporary HOA board cooperated fully. They opened records, released documents, worked with investigators. Residents appreciated the transparency. Trust remained damaged, but at least people felt someone was finally trying to rebuild it. Then the audit committee uncovered something that shocked even experienced observers. Several community projects approved during disputed elections had generated substantial payments despite incomplete work. One project existed mostly on paper. Another appeared significantly overbilled. A third contained documentation that didn't match physical inspections. The findings became front-page news. Again, by then even national outlets were revisiting the story. Not because of the ramp anymore, because the ramp had become the doorway into something much larger. One evening Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. She looked exhausted. Weeks of reporting had clearly taken a toll. Investigative journalism isn't glamorous. It's long hours and endless paperwork. Still, she carried that same focused expression. The one I'd come to recognize. "You okay?" I asked. She laughed. "I've read more HOA records in 6 months than any human should." I couldn't argue with that. Then her expression became serious. "They're close." Close to what? Decisions. That was all she said. She didn't need to explain. Investigations eventually reach a point where evidence stops being collected and starts being evaluated. Apparently they were approaching that point. The waiting became difficult. Not because I wanted revenge. I didn't. Contrary to what some people assumed, I never spent months hoping someone would go to jail. What I wanted was accountability. There's a difference. A big difference. Accountability means actions have consequences. Without that principle, communities stop functioning. Trust disappears. Rules become meaningless. People stop believing fairness exists. That damage lasts a long time. A month later, the first major legal action arrived. The county prosecutor announced formal charges against Carol's brother related to financial misconduct connected to community contracts. The news hit like a thunderclap. Residents flooded social media. Local talk radio exploded. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse. The charges themselves were complicated. Financial crimes usually are. But the basic allegation was simple. Money intended for community purposes had been improperly handled. The defendant pleaded not guilty. His attorneys issued statements. The legal process began. Yet everyone understood the same thing. Investigators rarely stop with a single person when examining complex schemes. Questions immediately shifted elsewhere. Who knew? Who approved what? Who benefited? And perhaps most importantly, who signed the documents? That question became central, because investigators increasingly focused on election records and authorization forms. The very records previously described as potentially altered. Then came the announcement residents had been anticipating for months. A press conference. Not a leak. Not a rumor. An official press conference. The county prosecutor stood before microphones and outlined several findings. Most details remained confidential. Some legal matters were still pending. But one statement changed everything. Evidence suggested signatures on multiple HOA documents had been falsified. The room erupted with questions. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. The prosecutor declined further comment. He didn't need to say more. The implication was obvious. Someone had allegedly forged records connected to governance and financial approvals. That accusation carried enormous weight. Back in Cedar Ridge, people gathered in driveways discussing the news. Neighbors compared information, speculated, wondered what would happen next. Nobody seemed entirely surprised anymore. Months of revelations had prepared them. Still, hearing it officially felt different. Real.
Permanent.
That evening Ethan and I sat outside watching the sunset. The neighborhood looked calm. Children rode bicycles. Families walked dogs. Birds moved through the trees. It seemed impossible that so much turmoil had happened here. You think people learned anything? Ethan asked. I considered the question carefully. Some did. Not everyone?
No.
Why not? Because some lessons require honesty. And honesty is harder than most people admit. Instead, I smiled. Enough people learned. He nodded, then pointed toward the street. A new family had moved into one of the houses recently. Their young daughter used a mobility scooter. The temporary HOA board had already approved accessibility improvements without hesitation.
No arguments. No fines. No threats.
Just approval. The way it should have happened from the beginning. Ethan watched her for a moment, then smiled. I smiled too, because regardless of what happened in courtrooms or investigations, that mattered. Real change mattered. The next morning, however, another announcement shook the community. Grand jury proceedings had concluded, and prosecutors were preparing additional charges. This time, according to multiple reports, those charges would involve people residents knew very well, including the former HOA president herself. The news broke just after 9 in the morning. I wasn't watching television when it happened. I was in the garage organizing tools when my phone started vibrating nonstop. At first I ignored it. Then I noticed the number of notifications. Messages from neighbors, friends, former coworkers, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Something significant had happened. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and checked the screen. Every message said essentially the same thing. Turn on the news. Now, I walked inside. Laura was already standing in front of the television. The county prosecutor was holding another press conference. Reporters packed the room. Cameras lined every wall. The prosecutor spoke calmly, methodically, like someone reading facts rather than making history. But history was exactly what was happening. Formal criminal charges had been filed against Carol Bennett. The allegations included fraud-related offenses, falsification of official records, and multiple counts connected to documents used in HOA governance and financial approvals. For several seconds, neither Laura nor I spoke. Not because we were shocked, because after everything that had happened, seeing it become official felt strangely unreal. Months earlier, Carol had sat at the front of community meetings acting untouchable. Now she was facing criminal charges. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The story dominated every local station. National outlets picked it up within hours. By lunchtime, reporters had gathered outside Carol's house. By evening, legal analysts were discussing the case on television. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge residents reacted with a complicated mix of emotions. Some felt relieved. Others felt angry. A few felt sad. Not for Carol, for the community. Because regardless of the outcome, the neighborhood had been through something painful. Trust had been damaged. Friendships had been strained. People had spent months arguing, worrying, and choosing sides. Those wounds don't disappear overnight. That weekend, the temporary board organized a town hall meeting. Not a formal HOA session. A community conversation.
No cameras. No reporters.
Just residents. The turnout surprised everyone. Nearly 200 people attended. The atmosphere felt different than previous meetings. Less hostile. More reflective. People weren't focused on accusations anymore. They were focused on rebuilding. One by one, residents shared experiences. Stories of fear. Stories of frustration. Stories of regret. Several admitted they had remained silent longer than they should have. Others described feeling powerless. One woman stood up and apologized publicly for believing some of the rumors spread about our family. The room grew quiet. I thanked her, then sat back down. There wasn't much else to say. Healing rarely comes from dramatic speeches. Usually it comes from simple honesty. As the meeting continued, something became clear. The community wasn't just processing what happened. It was trying to understand how it happened. How intelligent people missed warning signs. How bad decisions continued for so long. How authority went unchallenged. Those questions mattered. because communities learn from answers, or repeat mistakes when they don't. Around that time, preparations began for the legal proceedings. Court dates were scheduled. Attorneys filed motions. Evidence lists expanded. The case was becoming increasingly complex. Financial records, email communications, election documents, witness testimony, thousands of pages. Thousands. The sheer volume was staggering. Rachel explained that major investigations often look simple from the outside. A headline appears. A charge is filed. People assume the story is straightforward. In reality, proving allegations requires enormous amounts of work, especially when documents span years, especially when multiple individuals are involved. Meanwhile, Ethan started his summer break. For the first time in months, he seemed relaxed. The pressure that had surrounded him began fading. Not completely, but noticeably. One afternoon we worked together in the backyard. Nothing important, just cleaning up flower beds and trimming bushes. At one point he leaned on a shovel and looked toward the ramp. You know what's weird? What? I almost forgot it was there. I followed his gaze. The ramp blended naturally into the house. Functional. Ordinary. Exactly what it was supposed to be. That's probably a good thing, I said. He smiled. Yeah. Sometimes progress looks dramatic. Sometimes it looks like forgetting to notice something that should have been normal all along. The criminal case continued advancing. More details emerged through court filings. Some information remained disputed. Other facts appeared increasingly difficult to challenge. Each development generated headlines. Each headline generated discussion. And through it all, investigators kept uncovering records. Additional records. Then more records. The volume seemed endless. One revelation particularly caught public attention. According to court documents, certain signatures connected to HOA approvals allegedly belonged to residents who had never attended the meetings in question. Some individuals reportedly learned their names appeared on official documents only after investigators contacted them. That detail shocked people. Not because paperwork was involved, because personal identities were involved. Residents suddenly wondered whether their own information had been used improperly. The temporary board responded by launching a comprehensive records review. Transparency became their priority. Every available document was examined. Every procedure was updated. Every safeguard was strengthened. The process wasn't exciting, but it was necessary. Trust is rebuilt through systems, not slogans. As summer progressed, national interest gradually shifted elsewhere. New stories emerged. New controversies appeared. That's how news cycles work. Yet locally, the case remained important. Very important. Court hearings continued drawing attention. Reporters continued attending. Residents continued watching. Then came one of the most significant developments yet. Several former board members agreed to cooperate with investigators. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Cooperation changes legal dynamics. Always, people immediately began speculating. What information would be provided? What evidence existed? Who else might be affected? Nobody knew. At least not publicly. But experienced observers understood the implications. Cases become much stronger when insiders start talking. One evening Rachel joined us for dinner. After months of interviews and conversations, she'd become something close to a family friend. Not exactly family, but close enough. During the meal, Ethan asked her a question. What's the biggest thing you learned from all this? Rachel thought for a moment, then answered, that ordinary people matter more than they think. The table grew quiet. She continued, most major stories start because one person decides something isn't right. I understood what she meant. Months earlier, this entire situation revolved around a single fine. One letter, one ramp, one decision. Nobody could have predicted where it would lead. Not then. Not at the beginning. As the evening ended, Rachel gathered her notes and prepared to leave. Before walking out the door, she paused. They're discussing plea negotiations. That got my attention immediately. Because plea negotiations usually mean something important, something significant, something close. And if the reports were accurate, the next chapter of the story might arrive much sooner than anyone expected. The first plea deal news didn't come from the courtroom. It came from a neighbor's phone call at 6:42 in the morning. I was already awake, like I usually am, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the lights slowly come up over the trees. Ethan was still asleep. Laura was grading papers at the dining table. When the phone rang, I knew before answering that something had changed. It was Mr. Thompson from 2 streets over. His voice was different than usual. Lower, careful. They accepted a deal, he said. For who? There was a pause. Carol's brother. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, listening to the house settle around me. The next words confirmed what he meant. Guilty plea. Multiple counts. Financial stuff. They're saying more details will come out in court. After the call ended, I didn't move for a while. Not because I was surprised. Because once something reaches that stage, the story stops being speculation and becomes record. Official record. Laura looked up from her papers. What is it? I told her. She closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled slowly. I thought it would take longer, she said. It already took too long, I replied. By mid-morning, the news was everywhere. Local stations led with it, then regional outlets, then national headlines again. The tone was noticeably different this time. Less theory, more confirmation. The phrase plea agreement reached has a certain finality to it. People understand what it means even if they don't follow legal details. It means someone is no longer fighting the system. It means evidence was strong enough that denial was no longer useful. It means consequences are being negotiated instead of debated. Around the neighborhood, reactions were mixed but calmer than before. There was no shock left to give, only reflection. Some residents walked past our house and nodded. Others stopped to talk briefly. A few just waved. The anger that had defined earlier months had softened into something quieter. Understanding. Or exhaustion. Maybe both. Ethan noticed it too. On the way to physical therapy that afternoon, he looked out the window and said something I didn't expect. Feels like it's over. I glanced at him. It's not over yet. He nodded. But it feels different. He was right. Something had shifted. Not ended. Shifted. At the clinic, people recognized him again. But the energy was different now. Less like curiosity. More like respect. A receptionist who had followed the story came out to say hello. She didn't ask questions this time. Just smiled and told Ethan she was glad things were improving. He thanked her. Simple. Polite. Then we went inside. Meanwhile, legal proceedings continued unfolding in layers. Documents released to attorneys confirmed what investigators had suspected for months. Financial transfers tied to HOA-approved contracts were more complex than initially understood. Auditors were still untangling the details, but early summaries suggested a pattern of irregular approvals spanning multiple years. The important word was pattern, not isolated incident. Pattern. That changed how prosecutors approached the case. It wasn't just about one individual anymore. It was about systems. And systems involve multiple people. Back in the neighborhood, the temporary board was working overtime to stabilize operations. Their focus had shifted completely away from enforcement.
No fines. No penalties.
No aggressive letters. Instead, they focused on basic governance. Restoring transparency. Rebuilding trust. And making sure no one ever again had unchecked authority over residents without oversight. One afternoon, I attended an informational session they hosted. It was smaller than previous meetings. More structured. More practical. They presented updated bylaws, financial safeguards, and clear limits on board authority. A lot of it was technical, but one thing stood out. Every decision now required multiple levels of approval. No single person could authorize large expenditures. No single vote could override safeguards.
No ambiguity.
After the presentation, residents were invited to ask questions. Someone asked whether things would ever return to normal. The board president paused before answering. Normal is what allowed the problem to happen, he said. That's what we're trying to change. That answer stuck with people. Because it reframed everything. Normal wasn't always safe. Sometimes normal is just familiar. And familiarity can hide problems for a long time. Later that week, additional court filings were released. More details. More evidence summaries. More confirmations. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear enough. Investigators believed multiple individuals had participated in approving or facilitating actions that were now under criminal scrutiny. Not all details were public, but enough was known to understand the scope was widening. Then came the most discussed development yet. A motion filed by prosecutors indicated intent to introduce internal communications as evidence. Emails, messages, meeting notes, the kind of material that doesn't just show actions. It shows intent. That word, intent, came up again and again in news coverage. Because intent is what separates mistake from wrongdoing in legal terms. In the evening, Laura and I sat on the porch while Ethan worked on homework inside. The neighborhood was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels different after months of tension. Not peaceful exactly. More like paused. Laura finally spoke. Do you think people will remember this in a year? I thought about it. Some will. Will it change anything? I looked down the street. At the houses. At the ramps. At the sidewalks. Yes, I said. Some things already changed. And it was true. The neighborhood that had once reacted with silence now reacted with questions. The system that once allowed unchecked decisions now required oversight. The people who once stayed quiet now spoke up sooner. Change doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like procedures. Sometimes it looks like meetings that end differently than they used to. Sometimes it looks like a disabled teenager using a ramp without anyone questioning whether he should. As the sun set, Ethan came outside and joined us on the porch. He sat down quietly, watched the sky change colors. After a while he said, almost casually, I think I want to help people like me when I get older. Laura smiled. That sounds like a good plan. He shrugged. I don't know how yet. You've got time, I said. He nodded, then leaned back in his chair. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something shaped by conflict. It felt open. Meanwhile, in the legal system, everything was moving toward a point no one could fully see yet. The plea agreements were only the beginning, not the end. Because once financial misconduct, governance failures, and altered records enter the courtroom at this level, the final outcome is rarely simple. Takes time, takes testimony, takes scrutiny, and eventually, it takes decisions that will define accountability for everyone involved. But for the first time since this all began, the direction of the story was no longer uncertain. It was moving forward, and it was moving fast. The morning the indictment list became public, I didn't need a phone call or a news alert. I could feel it before I even checked the screen. The neighborhood was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is reading the same thing at the same time. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and saw two neighbors standing near the sidewalk, both holding their phones, both not speaking. One of them looked up at me. You should see this, he said. I already knew what this meant. Still, I took out my phone. The county prosecutor's office had released updated charges following the grand jury proceedings. The list was longer than anyone expected. Not just Carol's brother. Not just former board leadership. Several individuals connected to HOA operations, financial approvals, and record handling were now formally named in ongoing criminal proceedings. The language was careful, but the meaning was not. Multiple counts. Multiple defendants. Multiple layers of responsibility under review. Laura came outside while I was reading. She saw my expression and didn't ask what it was. She just waited. When I told her, she sat down slowly on the porch step. Ethan appeared behind her a moment later, still half asleep, rubbing his eyes. What happened? I handed him my phone. He read it in silence, then looked up. So it's really over now? I shook my head. No, I said. Now it's real. That morning, the neighborhood didn't function normally. People didn't linger outside. Kids still went to school. Cars still left driveways. But conversations were happening everywhere in low voices. Driveways, mailboxes, front yards. Everyone was processing the same thing. Accountability had moved from possibility to reality. By noon, the news cycle was fully engaged again. Analysts discussed the case in terms of governance failure. Legal experts broke down charges. Financial commentators discussed oversight breakdowns in community associations. Disability advocates returned to the original issue that started everything. A ramp, a fine, a decision that seemed small at the time, but had exposed something much larger. At some point that afternoon, Rachel called. Her voice was quieter than usual. Not tired exactly, measured. "They're preparing for arraignment," she said. "For all of them?" "Yes." I didn't respond immediately, because once proceedings reach that stage, the pace of everything changes again. "What happens next?" I asked. There was a pause. Discovery, depositions, and then court. Simple words, heavy meaning. After we hung up, I sat for a long time looking down the street. The same street where this entire situation began. It didn't feel like the same place anymore. Not because the houses had changed, because people had. Later that day, something unexpected happened. A small group of residents gathered near the entrance of the neighborhood. No signs.
No confrontación.
Just people talking. I walked over out of curiosity. Mr. Thompson was there again. So was Lisa, the accountant who had presented financial records months earlier. They weren't arguing. They were planning. Community committee. Informal at first. Focused on oversight, transparency, preventing anything like this from happening again. Someone had printed copies of proposed guidelines for HOA governance reform. They passed them around quietly, discussed them, suggested changes. There was no authority behind it yet, just intention. But it mattered, because it meant people weren't waiting for change anymore. They were building it. Ethan joined me halfway through the conversation. He listened more than he spoke. At one point, Lisa turned to him. "You should be part of this too," she said. He looked surprised. "I'm just a kid." "You're the reason half these changes exist," she replied. That made him quiet. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. On the walk back home, he asked me a question. "Do you think they'll go to jail?" I chose my words carefully. "I think some of them will face consequences, yes." He nodded. "Is that what you wanted?" I stopped walking. That question mattered more than most people would assume. Because by then, the story had become something larger than us. Media attention had faded somewhat, but legal momentum hadn't. And in situations like this, people often assume the outcome defines the intention. It doesn't. "I didn't want revenge," I said finally. "What did you want?" "Fairness." He thought about that, then nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Or maybe he would later. That evening, the temporary HOA board held another meeting. Attendance was smaller than earlier sessions, but more focused. They presented updates on ongoing reforms. Financial audits were continuing. Legal cooperation remained active. And most importantly, new safeguards were being implemented permanently. When the meeting ended, a few residents stayed behind. Not to argue, not to complain, just to talk. About rebuilding, about moving forward, about what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in now. Driving home afterward, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The ramp wasn't mentioned once. Not in the meeting, not in conversations, not in passing comments. It had become part of the structure of the house, part of daily life, no longer a topic, just reality. That realization stayed with me, because it showed something important. The original conflict had stopped being the center of attention. What replaced it was larger. Systems, responsibility, trust. And how fragile those things are when nobody is paying attention. Later that night, Ethan sat on the couch flipping through a notebook. "What are you working on?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just ideas." "What kind of ideas?" "Things I could do later. I sat down next to him. He pointed to a page. There were sketches. Simple ones. Accessible spaces. Community layouts. Ramps. Paths. He wasn't trying to design anything serious. Not yet. But the direction was clear. "You're thinking big," I said. He smiled slightly. "I guess." I didn't say anything else. Because sometimes the best thing you can do as a parent is not interrupt a thought that's still forming. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet again. But not the same quiet as before. This time it felt like something had settled. Not ended. Settled. And somewhere beyond the streets, beyond the county offices, beyond the news cycle, the legal process continued moving forward. Methodically, slowly, but inevitably, toward outcomes that would define responsibility for everything that had happened here. And for the first time in a long time, nobody in Cedar Ridge was guessing what would happen next. They were just waiting to see it finished. The courthouse parking lot was already full when I arrived. That alone told me how far this had gone. I had attended court hearings before in my life, but usually for routine matters. Traffic incidents. Small claims. Nothing that drew media vans or crowds of reporters standing near the entrance like it was a public event. Today was different. Today felt like an ending trying to decide how it wanted to land. Ethan stayed home from school. Laura came with me. We didn't speak much on the drive. There wasn't anything new left to say. Everything important had already been said in fragments over months. Now it was just about seeing what those fragments became when placed in front of a judge. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was controlled but heavy. Lawyers moved with quiet urgency. Defendants avoided eye contact. Reporters typed constantly, not looking up. And at the center of it all was paperwork. Stacks of it. Organized into binders, folders, exhibits, timelines. It always comes back to paper in cases like this. Not emotion. Not opinion. Paper. I sat in the back row and watched as names were called. Each one brought a small shift in the room. Some defendants looked exhausted. Others looked numb. A few looked like they still couldn't believe they were there. Then Carol's name was called. She walked in differently than I remembered her from HOA meetings. No confidence. No sharpness. Just a controlled, careful walk, like someone trying not to attract attention in a room already watching too closely. She didn't look at me. I didn't expect her to. The proceedings moved slowly, almost painfully so. Legal language filled the room in waves. Charges were read. Responses recorded. Motions acknowledged. At times it felt less like a story and more like a system doing what it was designed to do, even if it took a long time to get there. Then came the evidence summaries. Emails. Financial records. Election documents. Contract approvals. Witness statements. Each category added weight to what everyone already understood. This wasn't about one decision anymore. It was about repeated decisions made over time. Patterns, not moments. At one point, the prosecutor referenced the original homeowner complaints. The ramp, the fines, the escalation. I noticed Ethan's name mentioned briefly in the written submission as part of the initial trigger for investigation. Hearing it in that setting felt strange. Not dramatic, just final in a way I hadn't expected. The defense arguments tried to separate responsibility. Individual actions, miscommunication, procedural confusion. But every argument seemed to run into the same problem. Documentation. Because documentation doesn't argue back. It just exists. After several hours, the judge called a recess. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded attorneys immediately. Questions came fast, overlapping, urgent. I stayed back. Laura stood beside me. "You okay?" she asked. I considered the question honestly. "I think so," I said. But what I meant was more complicated. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even really relieved. It felt like standing at the end of a long road and realizing you remembered every step, even the ones you wish you hadn't taken. Ethan called during the break. I stepped away to answer. "How's it going?" he asked. "It's happening," I said. There was a pause. "Is it weird?" "Yes." He laughed slightly. "I figured." We didn't talk long. There wasn't much distance between what he was feeling at home and what I was seeing in court. Different places. Same story. When proceedings resumed, the judge began outlining preliminary findings and acknowledgments of evidence strength. Not final sentencing. Not yet. But direction matters in court. And the direction was clear. By late afternoon, the session adjourned.
No dramatic verdict.
No sudden resolution. Just a continuation of a process that had already been set in motion long before anyone in that room fully understood its scope. Outside, the light had shifted. The courthouse steps were crowded again, but quieter now. Reporters lowered microphones slightly. Lawyers spoke in smaller groups. Families moved toward their cars. It felt less like a spectacle and more like something slowly settling into place. On the drive home, Laura finally spoke. "It's strange," she said. "What is? How something so small started all of this." I knew what she meant. A ramp. A fine. A letter. If you isolate it, it seems almost insignificant. But nothing exists in isolation. Not really. "It wasn't small to him," I said. She nodded. "That's true." When we got home, Ethan was waiting outside. He didn't ask how it went immediately. He just looked at us, waiting for tone more than details. "It's still going," I told him. He nodded. "Okay." We sat together on the porch for a while. No one rushed to fill the silence. Across the street, a neighbor was fixing a fence. Another was watering plants. Life continuing in parallel with everything that had just happened miles away in a courtroom. Eventually, Ethan spoke again. "Do you think it's better now?" I looked around. At the neighborhood. At the houses. At the ramp that had once been a source of conflict and was now simply part of the home. "Yes," I said.
Ido.
Not because everything was perfect. Not because every problem was solved. But because the rules that failed us once were no longer the same rules we lived under. That matters more than people realize. Later that evening, Rachel sent one final message. No interview request. No update. Just a note. Whatever happens next. This changed more than one neighborhood. I read it twice, then put my phone down. Because she was right. It had started in one place, but it had already spread further than that. In ways that couldn't be measured by court documents alone. That night, as the house settled into silence, I walked past Ethan's room and saw him sketching again. Same notebook. New page. This time not just ramps. Community spaces. Paths that connected instead of excluded. Designs that assumed access instead of reacting to its absence. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there for a moment, then kept walking. Outside, the porch light stayed on. Not because anything needed watching anymore, but because some habits stay long after the emergency is over. And somewhere in the distance, far beyond courtrooms and headlines, the final phase of the legal process continued quietly toward resolution. Not fast, not dramatic, but certain. And for the first time since that envelope arrived months ago, the future didn't feel like something being fought over. It felt like something being rebuilt.